he awoke to a pinkish, orange light filtering through the billowing linen curtains of his cabin window. It was such that he still had slight difficulty seeing inside the ship. The browns and tans of the wood and painted metal paneling absorbed the light, giving everything a hazy, yet not altogether unpleasant glow. He propped himself up on the cot to better appreciate the feel of the breeze on his slightly sticky skin. It was nice, but not enough. He had the urge to get outside. He did his business and exited the cabin. The promenade deck was just above. He climbed some stairs, chose the port exterior door, and pulled it open. That pinkish orange inside the ship blended together with the one outside. The atmosphere was thick with water. Not enough wind to blow it all away. Not enough wind to cool the world down with. The seas were thus calm, and though not mirror-like, reflected the hue of the sky very well. Still, the breeze afforded by the motion of the ship was felt much more strongly on the promenade deck. He closed the door behind him as gently as possible and started walking towards the bow, into the wind. There was no one else around him. He hadn't checked the clock in the stairwell when walking past, so he guessed he woke up early enough today to miss the familiar sight of those older passengers on their daily morning walk. Or maybe the surreal tranquility of the sea compelled everyone to follow along. He suspected more people would eventually join him outside, and decided to make the most of the temporary solitude. Even through the haze, he could make out majestic cumulonimbus clouds on the horizon. Their tops were white, their bottoms dark. Even darker still was a distant line of smoke trails, more or less evenly spaced out. There were perhaps 15 or 20 of them, a group of ships, and from the way the plumes of smoke drifted up in this windless atmosphere, they were traveling in the same direction as his vessel. Some of the plumes were thicker than the others, all near the center of the group. It was more than a group. It was a convoy. It was just as he had forecasted, that his ferry would arrive at more or less the same time, although he hadn't expected to actually see them underway. A coincidence which could be called pleasantly surprising if he was someone more interested in the subject matter. Two familiar faces greeted him as he wrapped around the forward walkway. A vacationing couple that he had said hello to several times over the past few days. They stood and watched the horizon together. One had a rather large monocular around her neck, the other a white, wide-brimmed hat glowing in the morning light, strapped tightly against his chin. "Good morning." "Good morning." "It's just so wet. Did you wake up in a sweat too?" "Yeah, you too, huh?" The man flapped his shirt while comically panting. "It's dry where we're from, so we're still not used to it. I read it's better in the city because of the faults, but they always say stuff like that in the guides. Well, we'll see as we get closer." They waved at each other as he walked past and left the bow. It took the starboard stairway up to the Lido deck and continued walking, now the wind at his back. The short aft funnels lay silent. He supposed the ferry could get by on battery power in these calm seas. Another pair up ahead, 2 crew members chatting quietly in the smoking area. Buckets and brushes at their feet told him that they were just about to scrub the deck. He didn't want to get in their way. They exchanged nods as he took some stairs back down to the promenade. As he made his way towards the stern of the ship, he wondered whether he should have gone back inside for his company-issued camera, but for what felt like the 30th time on this assignment, he reminded and resigned himself to just how useless the supplied lens was. Someone in charge of digging around the equipment closet must have picked the smallest lens on the shelf out of consideration for how far away he'd be traveling, how cramped his modes of transportation, how starved for space his bags would be. A pancake lens, that was what they gave him. This someone in charge, so kind as he imagined they must have been, probably failed to notice that it was an ultra-wide pancake. Or, who knows, maybe an ultra-wide was exactly the lens they meant for him. At that focal length, the plumes of smoke he saw earlier would barely register on a printed photo, appearing more like image or printing defects than actual subject material. With the cumulonimbi in the background and that pinkish-orange haze, which was turning into more of a pinkish yellow by the minute, it would probably make for a dreamy landscape photo, a nice vacation memory, something for himself, not for release. As he rounded the gentle curve of the aft walkway, he made a mental note to find some kind of photography shop. Although, who knew what prices for luxury goods would be like in an isolated Channel city? He really had no idea. He abruptly cut his loop around the promenade short at the next door and entered back inside. His mind changed. There'd be some trouble back in office. After all this effort to send him out overseas, if he didn't have proof that he'd at least tried to get a shot of everything. What was it called? Malicious compliance. Although he didn't want to come off as malicious, just compliant to the best of his ability. He would go get that stupid camera and take a photo of that convoy when he still had the chance to. After that, he figured that the first batch of breakfast would probably be just about ready by then. Looks like he'd be able to join the early birds in their morning banter after all. A delay, with a distinct tinge of apologetic frustration in her voice. The captain had announced that they would have to hold position for at least 5 hours while something was sorted out at port. All of the other ships around them were evidently told the same. No more sailing meant no more breeze, and so the humid world made its debilitating presence known once more. Now everyone was outside, choosing one poison over another. For the second time that morning, he went up to the Lido deck. Most people preferred the shade of the covered walkway below than the all-out assault of the sun above. He did too, but even just thinking about the sheer number of people below, all close to each other, talking loudly and fanning themselves with magazines, made him feel sticky. He put himself down on a wooden bench cross-legged, a small bag to his side, and then hunched forward with his elbows on his knees. He, too, had a wide-brimmed hat, but his was black. Just from the small act of walking up here, a ring of wetness was already burning where the hat met his head. The haze was still there, but the rising sun had turned that pinkish orange into a pinkish yellow in the late morning, and now a full-on light yellow by noon. This new haze was decidedly less pleasant to be in than the one he had woken up to. Once more, he turned his gaze out port side towards the horizon and all those majestic clouds, except this time he tried to empty his mind as much as someone like him could. He squinted against the brightness of daytime, yet his blinking slowed down considerably, except when a bead of sweat made its way near his eyes. The heat and humidity turned into something of the insides of a blanket on a cold winter's day. After some time under the sun, it became clear to him that the convoy spotted earlier was not subject to the same delay. They were much further forward, and although hard to see, moving further forward still. He supposed that the shape of their exhaust plumes should have been proof enough of the relative freedom. The more oblique the angle between the ferry and the convoy, the more that neatly separated line of smoke trails gradually merged into an indistinct mass. This small observation shook him out of the heat-induced stupor long enough for him to unzip his bag and take his camera out. Too lazy to take off his hat in order to take a portrait photo, he settled for a landscape shot of that convoy, so very, very far away. A bit of the promenade deck below occupied a corner of the shot. A few other passengers in frame. He did that and then zipped the camera inside the bag back up. He wasn't completely sure if the bag was doing anything to protect the camera against the heat of direct sunlight, or the wetness of the air they were in, but he chose to believe that it did. This was stupid. If he was going to sit in a trance, he would do it in the shade, and if he was going to do it in the shade, he'd rather do it away from other sweaty people. He uncrossed his stiff legs and stretched his arms into the air as he stood up. Back down to his cabin he went. He awoke to a pinkish, orange light filtering through the billowing linen curtains of his cabin window. The wind blowing felt nice and cool. A familiar low hum had returned. They had gotten underway during his unplanned nap. The combustion engines now turned on. He raised his head up from the desk where he had been trying to write. Wherever they were by now, the air was much better, but he would still need to shower for the second time today. Through the curtains and out the window, he could make out a few other watercraft passing by left and right. He sat up quickly. That could only mean that they were close, although not close enough to warrant the bridge issuing an announcement that would have woken him up. He had the urge to get out on deck. He did his business, packed all of his things into his duffel bag just in case, slung his hat and that fashion accessory of a company-issued camera around his shoulder, and then exited the cabin. Once again, he climbed some stairs, chose the aft exterior door, and pulled it open. That pinkish orange inside the ship blended together with the one outside. It felt like the early afternoon now. There were waves on the water's surface. Still, he could make out those same majestic cumulonimbi, although now they felt a bit further away than before. There was a mist in the atmosphere, one that you could see the layers and pockets of moving to and fro with the currents of the wind. And yet it was not a thick mist, nor was it a turbulent atmosphere. Behind of and to either side of the ferry were ships and boats of all shapes and sizes, neatly lined up one after another, with plenty of distance in between, each line made up of similarly sized watercraft. Based on the two ships he could make out far behind them, he surmised that they were currently in a line of other, moderately sized passenger vessels. There were at least 2 or 3 more lines of similarly sized ships of varying types to port, at least 3 or 4 to starboard, the furthest 2 of which seemed like lines for the biggest ships. They seemed like the busiest lines of all, stretching far back into the horizon. A few nimbler boats weaved in between the traffic. It all felt at once crowded where they were, a bit like a parade, and yet lonely. The other watercraft were just a bit too far to clearly make out anything or anyone on board. He wished he could wave at them. Clockwise to port he once more walked. The mist became more of a spray as he rounded the bend of the promenade. He slipped his hat on while passing a few other passengers braving the wetness. Many of them seemed like die-hard photo enthusiasts, having a good time despite the dreary conditions, willing to get themselves and their gear a bit wet if it meant grabbing a nice shot or two, although most of them still had their cameras hanging idle on their chests, rather than up and at the ready. They were waiting. He smiled at their enthusiasm and stopped to lean against the railing. He stuck his head out to survey their destination, which he guessed could have been in view by now. A dozen or so kilometers ahead of the ferry, what appeared to be a dense wall of fog stretched far into the horizon on either side of them. But he knew it was not fog, partly because the skies around and above that wall were mostly clear, and partly because he knew where they were headed. He wanted to get a better view. Sight lines on the Lido deck were obstructed by the forward funnels, so the promenade was all they had. He left the railing and proceeded along the walkway. As the ferry and the ships around them neared the wall, all chatter among the passengers grew quiet. They plunged into it. He was reminded of the feeling that one gets when standing on a beach, right at the waterline, watching the waves race towards you and then crash around your feet, your toes sinking into the sand. A feeling of sudden envelopment. The world quickly turned a bluish gray. No one could see beyond a few meters for a minute or so, and everyone was silent. Then that pinkish orange began to penetrate the mist above the ferry, and the world gradually returned. They saw before them the great waterfall that split the world in half, and the city that split that waterfall in two. Many cameras were raised.